Last month we all met Amanda Todd. Unfortunately, it was posthumously. While all the media were talking about the horrors of bullying, I was appalled by the below-standard mental health care that she received. Bullying is not the cause of death. Amanda Todd took her life because she had fallen into the abyss of a mental health care crisis. The stigma of mental illness can lead to unnecessary death because we fear telling others that we have been diagnosed with a mental illness. And then just a few weeks ago, we were shown the videos of the maltreatment of Ashley Smith, a young girl sent to jail for throwing crab apples at a postman and is now dead, taking her own life in front of people who were responsible for her safekeeping. The video reminded me of a B-movie trailer. Ashley looked like an alien specimen in a science fiction movie ready for dissection. And she was treated like Hannibal Lecter from Silence of the Lambs, trussed up and tied into a chair. And we wonder why people don't talk about mental illness. Talking about mental illness isn't easy. How does one talk about an illness that so many people prefer to avoid talking about? Mental illness isn't a topic that screams interactive, hey, let's share. I know that Bell has a commercial calling to us, let's talk, but it is much easier to share medical information when it is about physical ailments, heart, blood pressure, diabetes, or we tell a friend when a lump has been found. But we don't tend to mention the fact that our doctor is sending us to a psychiatrist because we have lost all interest in life and estrogen supplements and Viagra just won't do it. I started to write about mental illness when I was given the opportunity to do a radio program on any topic I wanted, and I realized that it would be best to talk about things I know well. I have an intimate relationship with mental illness. A new report released last month in Ontario, Opening Eyes, Opening Minds, concluded that mental illness and addictions are often misunderstood, misdiagnosed, and ignored, including in the healthcare system. I doubt many of you read this report. It didn't make the front page of any section of our newspapers. Most of us hear about mental illness when it is connected to murder, mayhem, and chaos. Bodies decapitated, men shooting guns into movie theaters. More recently in Winnipeg, a young man tortured a family. There are an unlimited number of celebrities that go in and out of rehab for addiction or mental illness or concurrent disorders. I still remember the big media scene over Charlie Sheen last year. Then, of course, there's always Lindsay Lohan. Name another disease or illness that society would treat with such disrespect. Is it any wonder that people with mental illness, especially young people, don't acknowledge the possibility that they have a problem? Mental health problems and illnesses are estimated to cost the economy about $33 billion a year. Mental illness afflicts more than 20% of our population. That is 7 million Canadians. But that number does not include collateral damage. Mental illness in a family hurts the one suffering with it as well as the rest of the family, friends, and the community. Today, there are many children who are caregivers for their parents who have mental illness. They remind them to take their medications. They help care for other siblings. They assist with cooking and cleaning. And then they have to get themselves off to school. Yes, without question, there is a difference between having a mental illness and a physical illness. People with diabetes or heart conditions don't tend to kill others or themselves. Just a few weeks ago, we heard again about the mother in England who killed her 2 infant children. She had taken herself off her medications for severe depression. But mental illness gets short shrift in the public forum because it continues to carry a severe stigma. Still, I've always said I would rather have a mental illness than care for someone with it. I've been on both sides. I wrote and produced a 6-part radio series, The Many Voices of Mental Illness, in an attempt to normalize this disease. Mental illness has an aura of fear around it. We are perceived as plain scary, like Norman Bates from Psycho, or the lunatic that guns down innocent bystanders. The truth is, we are your neighbors and friends, your hairstylist and accountant, quite possibly your doctor and lawyer, and might be sitting right next to you. Had you met me at the grocery store, you would never known that I have a mental illness. The stigma that is still associated with mental illness keeps so many in the closet. Fear is our biggest enemy. Fear of receiving the diagnosis, fear of accessing care, fear of others finding out, fear of those with mental illness. It just isn't cool or sexy to have a mental illness. You don't see the famous or the infamous proudly wearing a bracelet identifying them with the needs of the mentally ill. There is no shame in having a mental illness. I want to repeat that. There is no shame in mental illness. It is no more shameful than heart disease, cancer, HIV/AIDS, or diabetes. In the United States, twice as many people live with schizophrenia than as those with HIV/AIDS. I can assure you from personal experience that mental illness is only a detour in life, not a dead end. We cannot choose events that befall us, but we can choose how we will respond to them. As a matter of fact, like any stumbling block placed before us, we can come out the other side of mental illness bitter or better. Like so many others, I have come out better. Different, but better. Today, I'm going to talk about my journey through mental illness, the good, the bad, and the ugly. When I look back at my life, I know that I did not love those I loved in the way I wanted. I had felt for the longest time that there was a wall of Vaseline between me and the world, a slight disconnect. My mother had always said to me that when I was good, I was very good, but when I was bad, well, I had moods. We didn't know, though, that those moods were indicative of an underlying, waiting in the wings mental illness. In 1999, when I was 48, a diagnosis of chronic recurrent depression reframed my past. I came to see that depression had been my constant companion, discoloring everything. But like a fish in water, you don't know it until you are out of it. Depression is not some sadness over a loss. It is much different. It is deeper, darker, and heavier. It is mind-numbing. It is exhausting. At times it was so bad I could not get out of bed. I could barely move a limb. It is an exhaustion that feels like Atlas looks. Mind stalks me stealthily, like a creature in the night, waiting patiently for the right moment to seep inside me without warning, then envelops me in darkness that gets progressively thicker. I lose all feeling. I just don't care. I have no highs, no lows, just indifference. Depression is nasty because it attacks the mind, the body, and the soul. When you don't know or refuse to acknowledge depression, you condemn yourself to dwelling in the silence. I never thought of mental illness as shameful. I grew up in a home with a parent with mental illness. Perhaps my parents, in their desire to protect us, just never talked about it. And when my father had his episodes, we were protected for the most part, like keeping your children any information that might have to do with some horrible physical illness, and you don't want them to worry. So, when I was finally diagnosed in 1999, I actually felt relieved. all my years of living with generalized fear and anxiety, and my chronic sense of sadness made sense. I was always anxious growing up. I feared anything new, anything different. I wasn't much of a joiner. I was more a loner. I spent a lot of time in my room. I am third generation living with mental illness. My father's mother and her two sisters had mental illnesses. You will notice throughout that I say living with rather than suffering with. I don't suffer. I refuse to be a victim. As it happens, not only was I genetically primed to be predisposed to some kind of mental illness, I was also environmentally primed. There is a new science called epigenetics that speaks to how our environment can affect us, beginning from within the womb to the nurturing of our parents to our own life experiences. This is a new understanding of the old question, is it nature or nurture? Is it genetic or is it your mother's fault? Very simply, the genes we inherit come with switches that can be turned on or off as a result of what one experiences. Twins have the same genetic material from their parents, yet one may get a disease that the other does not, even though both may be predisposed. This will begin to make sense in a moment. My parents had two children, two sons, 2 years apart. The oldest son took ill at 2.5 and died at home. Police, fire department, ambulance, family doctor, all in attendance. Nothing could be done. I came along 2 years later. I came home to live in the same house and for all I know the same bedroom. I never asked. I only learned about my other brother, Martin, when I was 8 or 9. We didn't talk of him until my mother was well into her 80s. It was as if he never was. And I didn't speak of him with my father until my father was in a coma. I realized when I became a mother and then a grandmother that he had always been there, and I realized that he was in me. I carried him. I still carry him within. I can barely imagine my parents' anxiety, especially my father because of his illness. With the knowledge I now have about mental illness, I am amazed at his ability to have lived a good life. And then my mother's anxiety, beginning with me in the womb. I remember growing up. My father would panic when I got sick and leave the house. My mother's sister would leave her family and come and help out. My grandmother would have her outside my bedroom door. So I grew up in a home filled with an undercurrent of anxiety that I unconsciously internalized. Any switches having to do with anxiety must have been busy while I was in the womb and during those early years. Once these switches are turned on or off, that pattern can then be inherited. If my parents had not experienced the death of a child, I might not have been born with such a strong propensity for anxiety and fear. And all that was made worse in my own life experiences. Getting lost at the CNE twice in one day when I was 4 did not help with my anxiety. I still get moments of panic when I'm in a store and lose the person I came with. When I became a parent for the first time, I cried a lot, and I realized that I was not really connecting to my first child, but it never occurred to me that I was in a depression. I spent many of my later adult years starting the day off in the shower, crying. I found myself in powder rooms at restaurants, crying. I spent many an afternoon on the family room couch, crying. I raised 3 children during all of this. I had happy days and profoundly sad days. I was a good parent, but I know I would have been better if I had been better, and we all would have been happier. My mental illness was not severe enough to interfere with my ability to live a life that I thought was like everyone else. But mental illness, when not diagnosed, has unintended consequences because it does affect a family. There is always at least one other family member who vicariously suffers. Do I wallow in regret? Do I beat myself up? No, that's pointless. We do the best we can as parents. Our children do not always get what they want, and as parents, we cannot always give them what they need. Whether living with mental illness or heart disease, cancer, or unemployment, it is all part of the human experience. Major life changes, though, can affect us physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. 15 years ago, I initiated a divorce. It was the most difficult decision in my life. Among other things, it meant heading into the unknown, not a good place for me. It was frightening for me. It triggered horrible anxiety. Anxiety is a funny thing. Some of us can handle a great deal of anxiety and stress. Some people thrive on stress. Others crumble at the first sign of it. Think of stress as tea in a cup. Some of us come into the world with just a little tea in our cups. Others, like me, arrive with the tea just hovering over the rim, and the cup quickly fills, spills over, and makes a mess. My cup ran over, and the mess was depression. Some people are fine almost their entire lives, and then a major stressor comes along. Divorce, retirement, death of a relationship, a loved one, or a dream, moving from your matrimonial home into an apartment or assisted living, and the cup suddenly runneth over. And then you notice that you're more tired than usual. You don't enjoy going out as much. You lose your appetite. Your sleeping patterns change. You're not as careful about dressing and showering. You have a generalized feeling of blah. These can be signs of the onset of depression, and you need to pay attention in the same way you'll pay attention to any physical changes or ailments. When my anxiety hit, I was so anxious I couldn't eat. I felt jello-y all the time. I couldn't make decisions. I found myself crying uncontrollably when I least expected, and often in public. I was overwhelmed with a desire to run all the time. There was no place to run because I really wanted to run from myself. I saw my family doctor, and the first time I said suicide out loud. She arranged an appointment with a psychiatrist. With the psychiatrist's help and medication, I was coping. My raft was gently floating down the river. And then I hit the bank hard. A year after my diagnosis, I went into hospital for minor surgery, and 10 days later came out with a colostomy bag. The doctor had unknowingly perforated my bowel, and I didn't see him again for 4 days. Another surgeon opened me up, removed the unhealthy section of bowel, clamped off one end, and brought the other end out my left side and attached it to a bag. When it came time to go home, I had to put on street clothes. I had this bag attached to me. I didn't know what to wear. How would my pants fit over the bag? My youngest daughter went out to buy new loose-fit pants for me with a waistband that I could adjust. But when I went to get dressed, I fell apart. Where do I put the bag? Does it go inside my underwear or outside? Do I need different underwear to hold the bag? When the bag fills, will it show through my clothes? Of all the things I had experienced, how to dress brought me to my knees. My eldest daughter was living and working in New York and calling me all the time. It was her wry sense of humor that put it all in perspective. "So, Mum," she said, "do you match your shoes or your dress to your bag?" And so it began. Just as I was recovering from my emergency surgery, I was rushed back in for more. I had developed sepsis. I was being poisoned by my own body. At this point, I was physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually bankrupt. I had never thought of myself as someone who gives up so easily. I was the one everyone depended upon. I don't know if I'd lost hope or that I was just exhausted from the marathon of the unexpected. I told my surgeon, this would be surgeon number 3, that this surgery was it. She told me unequivocally that I would go through as many surgeries as necessary to get me back to health. She proudly told me of a patient who had required 13 surgeries. I wasn't impressed. If 2 surgeries were overwhelming, 13 were inconceivable. But it was then that I began to understand the true depths of depression, the kind that leads to serious thoughts of suicide. I was moving along the suicide spectrum, which began with, "I wish I didn't have to get up this morning," to "I wish I were dead." Never dismiss someone who talks like that. My depression left me with a sensation of emptiness, hopelessness, of being a burden, and not just physically. I wanted out. Caring for someone with extreme depression is exhausting, and who wants to be the one to exhaust the ones you love? It was my sense of helplessness which I found more devastating than any other emotion. There was the physical pain, the kind that starts at the toes and screams up the legs and throughout the whole body from inside out, and steals your free will, your ability to think clearly and choose life. It was the type of pain that brings thoughts of death and quickly erases the memories that make life worth living. Pain is the devil, the serpent in the garden, tempting you to eat of the fruit of death. And then there is mental, emotional, and spiritual pain. The total lack of control over life because some other force has taken over. Suicide is the ultimate act of control, the ultimate expression of the desire for order. In the mind of one who wants to die, it is a well thought out, justified act of selflessness. My loved ones will be fine. I won't become a burden to them. Suicide comes to symbolize peace. It all seems so normal, except the one considering suicide is suffering from an illness so overwhelming that her decision-making is not functioning. I was at that moment mentally ill. Secular sciences, represented by sociologists, psychologists, and psychiatrists, were not sufficient at that moment in time to keep me alive. It was my religion that sustained me while I continued to receive help from the psychosocial therapies. One might ask why the love of and for my family, my widowed mother, my 3 children, was not enough to keep me here. I have no answer. I am grateful, though, that I had one more therapy to turn to for help. I reached out to my rabbi. Spiritual care is as important as talk therapy and drugs in the treatment of mental illness. I remember driving to the synagogue, exhausted. Everything at that time was exhausting. I went to see him in his office. When I look back, I picture a dark room, but I think it was more that I was in a dark place. I had been attending services and classes regularly for some time, so he knew of my love of study, of parsing biblical stories and searching out meaning. My rabbi held on to me by tapping into a part of me that is deeply connected to God. He reminded me that as a child of God, I do not have the right to take my own life. I am obligated to choose life for you and your children. He said the most important thing I could do was study God's teachings. He gave me the reason to live while taking away any thought of taking my own life. Just read a few sentences a day, perhaps a prayer. I had a purpose. Study, stay alive. There was comfort and relief in my rabbi's message. His words, his compassion, his reference to the biblical commandment to choose life, and that study, something dear to me, was the greatest of all commandments, lifted the burden from my shoulders. I was no longer in a state of anxiety, choosing between life and death. My deep depression did not lift right away, but at that moment, talking to my rabbi gave me hope. It was as if I had been holding my breath, and now I could breathe again. Healing of my soul could begin because I was no longer in fear of losing it. It was for me, I think, the same feeling of relief that my Christian patients expressed to me when I had encouraged them to visualize laying their burdens down at the foot of the cross. My rabbi continued to provide spiritual care. 6 months later, when it was time for me to return to the hospital for surgery to hopefully reverse the colostomy, he came to the hospital and prayed with me. This time, I feared dying. I had come full circle, which was a good thing because life got in the way of living one more time. I developed terrible trouble with my memory. I went to a neurologist after I found myself at the side of the road, wondering where I was and where I was going. I thought I was suffering from early dementia. My brain scan was clear. Some of the loss could be attributed to the anesthetics, but my memory had been affected by the undiagnosed, untreated, chronic recurrent depression, which I had had for decades. The depression took up space in my brain, reducing memory space. I was unable to focus on reading or writing for almost 8 years. I could read, but nothing stayed in. I could no longer synthesize ideas across disciplines. I couldn't write because I couldn't organize my thoughts. I developed nausea when I'd go into libraries or bookstores, places that had been my sanctuaries. I found myself attracted to the magazine racks, magazines with lots of pictures. I was becoming a follower of Martha Stewart. The right side of my brain was exploring the world, while the left side was, I suppose, recuperating. Well, here I was doing well with medication and talk therapy. I had bouts of depression, but I felt well and in control of my life, my moods and feelings. But I shamefully admit I became a victim of Tom Crucifixion. Tom Cruise, the famous actor, preached to the world that those of us with mental illness did not need medication, and I listened to an actor. I began to think I was weak if I couldn't live without meds. I asked my psychiatrist to help me wean off. For 2 weeks, I was golden. I was feeling great. Then I crashed. I'd been feeling great because I was on the right medication and seeing my doctor. It takes a week, or a few weeks sometimes, 6, for medication to work. And it takes a few weeks for it to leave the system. So you feel great for a while. We tried one more time. I crashed quickly, and my psychiatrist told me I would be on medication for life. Now, when someone suggests that they have a new, more natural, better way, I laugh and say thanks, but no thanks. I wouldn't listen to someone suggesting I go off my thyroid medication, and Mark, my partner, would never think of going off his cardiac medications. We just seem to believe that we are weak if we take medication for a mental illness. But medication changes the chemicals in the brain, and that's why depression is relieved. Now, new research is suggesting that talk therapy can change the chemicals in the brain as well. That means for some people, talk is enough. It depends on the type of mental illness, in the same way that some people who are diabetic can take care of it with diet, others need medication. But this is a remarkable discovery. There are other ways of controlling depression that work hand in hand with talk and drug therapy, and they're free. Many years ago, when I was first diagnosed with depression, my pharmacist would say to me every time I went in for a repeat, "Walk. There's nothing better than walking." It's true. Walking, exercise, release wonderful endorphins that raise you up no matter how low you may be. And if you can walk in a beautiful place, it's even better. Mark knows when I'm going down the wrong path and will say, "Take the dog out." And I do. And the dog gets to listen to me the whole time we're out. If this dog could talk, the stories he would tell. You know the expression, "It's okay to talk to yourself, but you know you are in trouble when you answer your own questions"? I answer, and that's therapy too. Well, life was being well lived, but life is in the details. Wouldn't you know it, when another detail popped up in 2008? I needed help again. I was no longer living in Toronto, and I had stopped seeing my psychiatrist for some time. So I turned to a psychoanalyst, Dr. Stephen Fowler. Don't be afraid to take advantage of all different types of therapy. Each one, be it cognitive, who helps with changing the way you think and behave, to a psychiatrist who can prescribe drugs, or a psychologist or a spiritual care provider. All can help at different times. Dr. Fowler is a Freudian analyst, and he helped me to deconstruct stories in my life, to change their meaning, to make understanding my past better, so it made living in the present happier and made the outlook for my future better. Just as I have learned that different therapies help us at different times in our lives, different people respond differently to different therapies. Don't give up. Fight for your mental health. And take heart. There does come a time when you no longer need help, or as much or as often. How do you know when that time has come? You realize you have better control over your feelings and your behaviors, that you live in the light more often than the dark, that you want to get up most mornings. You're more confident in your ability to make decisions. You realize you can take care of yourself again. I want you to know that living with mental illness is no different than living with any other chronic illness. As a matter of fact, Dr. David Kozerginski, Chief of Psychiatry at William Osler, told me that people with mental illness have as good as, and sometimes better prognosis for getting well than those who have chronic physical illnesses. But like all chronic illnesses, mental illness needs to be kept under control and requires that you monitor yourself. I realize I'm always watching myself. I analyze my moods as I go through them. Most people don't pay attention to changes in mood. I notice when I'm starting to feel sad or unhappy. Is it just a moment in time? Or is this heading for an episode? Keeping track of my feelings is in a way the same as a diabetic monitoring sugar levels. It becomes a part of life, almost unconscious. But by being aware, I can live with the lows because I'm not taken by surprise. As odd as this sounds, living with my mental illness meant learning to let go of my depression. Mental illness, depression, has been my companion for most of my life, and over time I became attached to that dark side of my life. It is a place I know well. I was afraid to let go of that part of me, which was half of my personality. Wellness sometimes demands of us that we let go. Fear holds us back. Amputating a part of your behavior can be as frightening as amputating a limb. I learned that letting go of the part of me that was defined by depression would not lead to the melting away of the me that I knew. Now, every once in a while, when the darkness comes to call, I do welcome it. I like to embrace it for a short while. A familiar friend. I want to leave you with this last message. Mental illness knows no boundaries. Race, color, creed, culture, rich or poor, educated, illiterate, young or old. Yet, unfortunately, it still carries with it the stigma of generations of believing it is a weakness. It's mental, after all, not physical. There are those who still think that all one has to do is pull up your bootstraps, toughen up, think happy thoughts, walk on the sunny side of the street. It's all just in your head. For heaven's sake, would you just get over it? And that is the reason so many people with mental illness dwell in silence, their souls dying, their world shriveling. I prefer to think of mental illness as a brain disease. It sounds so much more sophisticated than mental illness. A brain disease has more cachet, to be worn proudly, like a badge of honor. The point is, mental illness is a brain illness, and like any other brain disease, chemicals in the brain malfunction, just as they do with Parkinson's and epilepsy. It is important to know in your heart and soul that mental illness is not a defect or moral weakness. And never let yourself be a victim. Take charge of your mental health. I said at the beginning that one can come out the other side of mental illness a better person, different but better. I have learned there are times when I must say no to friends or family. I need downtime. I've had to let go of people who were once friends. It isn't that they changed. It is I realized that they brought me down, and I would feel myself slip into a dark place. I started to like myself once I came out the other side. I smile a lot. I share in the joy of others when before I was too sad. Mark and I have been together almost 10 years. We laugh a lot. We travel a great deal. We entertain frequently, and we have a wide circle of friends. My children are married. We're blessed with 8 grandchildren. I rarely cry these days, except with joy. I look forward to getting up every morning. Well, almost. I have less fear and anxiety now about the unknown, more confidence in my abilities, as well as writing, producing, and narrating the many voices of mental illness that is now podcast on my website. I blog about mental illness, religion, and politics. I continue to write my book, Words That Bear Fruit, Teaching the Mind, Touching the Soul. I contribute to Convivium magazine that focuses on religion in the public square. I send letters and articles to the papers and magazines on a regular basis. I even accept rejection letters with equanimity. I have a mental illness. It is only a fragment of me. It does not define me. It need not define you.